Welcome everyone. So my name's Paul Needham. I'm the Director of Planning and Development Services with the City, and sat next to me is Louise Koroveshi, who's our Principal Strategic Planner. I'm going to run through a presentation that might take around 20 minutes and then we'll break for questions at that point. So yeah, welcome and hopefully we can give you some information that you find useful. Did mention before, it might be useful while I'm running through the presentation, if you can, everyone looks to have their cameras turned off. If you can mute your microphone, the IT just tends to work a little bit more seamlessly if we do it that way. What is a CHRMAP, as we call it, a Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Plan, and why do we need one? So it is a long-term 100-year time horizon plan that identifies potential risks to our coast, which are principally around coastal erosion, so beaches eroding, and flooding hazards, which is fairly self-explanatory. And then, of course, what we intend to do to manage those risks. It's not a detailed coastal management plan or program. It doesn't say what we're going to do in a particular place at a particular time necessarily. It is the general direction, the general strategy. Planning over such a long time period and at such a large scale is obviously inherently difficult and uncertain, but it's something we're required to do, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. I think it is also worth noting that in Busselton, we've been dealing with coastal hazards for well over 100 years. In fact, probably arguably for many thousands of years in some form or another. And we have got more vulnerable assets in terms of private land, buildings, infrastructure, roads, etc., and in fact environmental assets at risk than anywhere else in WA. And we also have a more dynamic coast than anywhere else in WA, and in fact a more dynamic coast than just about anywhere in the world. So the coast is moving around all the time, is basically what I'm talking about there. The process that we've been through to get to the point we're at today, we have to prepare this CHRMAP thing. It's a requirement of a state planning policy, which is called SPP 2.6, State Coastal Planning Policy. As I mentioned before, it's a 100-year planning timeframe, and over that timeframe, the policy requires us to consider and plan for the effects of 0.9 metres of sea level rise over that century. It doesn't mean that there will be 0.9 metres sea level rise, or that we think that is what's going to happen amongst city officers and climate scientists. But the state has said they've got climate science advice, the responsible approach, and that we have to develop a plan that seeks to address the risks that will arise if we get that sea level rise. So there's someone talking in the background. It might be nice if you were able to mute yourself. I think I might have done it for you. The process involves what we call coastal hazard modelling to try and work out what risks we may face over the 100-year time frame. It's then a risk management approach. It's not we have to reduce all risks to zero tomorrow. It's about how we manage the risk. The processes then involve some community and stakeholder consultation that's led up to this point. But of course, the process we're going through now is probably the most significant community and stakeholder consultation phase in the project. This phase runs until late August. After that, we'll then consider all the issues that are raised in submissions, and then we'll prepare a draft final CHRMAP that will be presented to the council for consideration later in the year. I'm going to talk a little bit about coastal processes and coastal change. So the image on the screen is an aerial photograph from January of this year, and some of you might recognise where it is. It's in Dunsborough. just the area sort of just to the west of Elmore Road. You may not be able to see super clearly, but on your screen, you'll see a little green line. And that line is where the back of the vegetation was, the start of the beach, if you like, in late 2017. So it gives you an idea of how much the coast has moved around in that about 3.5 year period. And just so you know, I'm telling the truth, that aerial photograph is from late 2017. So you can see where that green line has come from. The next aerial photograph is from 2003. And you can see that obviously in the period between 2003 and 2017, that section of the coast, there was quite a lot of erosion. And there was a little bit more erosion in the last few years as well. This next photograph, though, is still a base, is a 2003 aerial photograph, and there's 4 lines on the screen, and they're not all that easy to pick up. The 2003 vegetation line is this yellow line here. 2017 is that green one there. And I've got something's happened with my colours when they've got into this presentation, but 1985 is this line back here. And in fact, this red line through here is actually a line from some aerial photography from 1941, when we were lucky enough to have an American air base here, and they were practicing flying planes and took cameras up there with them. So you can see that over the course of the last 80 odd years now, this section of the coast has accreted, i.e. there's more sand from the sea landing on the coast than there is being eroded away. And it's moved out quite some distance, well over 100 metres. And then in more recent times, we've seen it erode. And it varies how much erosion there's been, but really illustrates that the coast is very, very dynamic and is moving around really every moment, every day. And over years and decades, those movements can be quite substantial. This next slide is just a bit of a look into the future. And it's fairly crude, I have to say. But you will see on the plan, you'll see a lot of little dots along the coast, and they're existing coastal protection structures, groins, seawalls mostly, that are there to help us manage coastal processes, to manage coastal erosion risk. The red line is a line, and again, it's fairly crude, but what it says, if we didn't do any coastal management at all, what erosion we may see over 100 years with 0.9 metres sea level rise. So you can see most of you will have some sort of reference points there. This is the jetty, obviously, here, and you can see that this is the Busselton town centre. Now, this is a section of the coast where there's quite a lot of coastal protections, and there has been in one form or another for a very long time. But it's saying if we didn't maintain those coastal protections, we could see effectively several hundred metres of erosion occur. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to flick through to the next slide. So it's quite risk-averse sort of modelling. It is probably some slightly worst case scenario, but it gives you an idea of what the risks might be if we weren't managing the coast over the coming decades. The other thing you'll see on this plan is some blue areas and some yellow areas. And again, very, very crude, but the Department of Transport has done some modelling of what would happen if we had effectively a cyclone that was a bit worse than Cyclone Albi that some of you may have heard of. It's the worst recorded storm in the European settlement of Busselton. If we were to have that storm a bit worse, and if it also came through at highest astronomical tide, and that would see water levels get to about 3.8 metres above sea level. And very crudely, everything that's blue is below 3.8 metres, and the yellow stuff is the stuff that's above 3.8 metres. So it probably does overstate the risk to some degree, but it gives you an idea of the pattern of risk that we may face if we don't manage these issues. I like this slide as well because it gives you an idea of sort of the scale that we're talking about. And these are all at exactly the same scale. So you can see City of Busselton on the right. It's a little bit bigger than just the City of Busselton. We've got a bit of Capel in there. But you can see our coastline is pretty close to being the same length as the coastline of the southern half of the Perth metropolitan area. You can see in the middle section there. And you can see in comparison with any other regional centres, far more development, far more coastline that we need to manage. Then the state planning policy identifies what they call an adaptation hierarchy. I'm going to quickly run through this. What they say is you've identified a risk, your first step should be to avoid development in the area that might be at risk. Now, I'm sure everyone who sort of knows Busselton would know that in the main, that's not something we can do. It's too late. We've already got private land and development and significant public infrastructure that is quite close to the coast, and it's not possible to deal with this issue by avoiding development in those areas. A little bit different to, for instance, a new suburb being developed in the northern suburbs of Perth, where you can get the development 200-300 metres setback from the coast, and for the next 100 years at least, you probably won't have anything in terms of major infrastructure that you need to worry about protecting. The hierarchy then says if you can't avoid, what you should do is plan to retreat, which essentially means allowing the coastline to erode and moving buildings and infrastructure before the buildings and infrastructure are affected by coastal erosion. That does mean as well things like, sewer pipes and water infrastructure you would need to relocate and potentially replace further inland. Also in Western Australian law, land that I guess is no longer land, private lots that are no longer dry land, in most cases will continue to be private land. So if that process was to occur without property being acquired by government, then it would continue to be private land, and you would end up in a situation where you no longer had a private beach or public beach or public foreshore reserves. If you decide that it's not practical to retreat, or it's not a good strategy to retreat, then we have to consider what's called accommodate strategies. Now, accommodate strategies don't really make sense when you're talking about coastal erosion, because essentially the land has ceased to exist. Where accommodate strategies potentially play more is in terms of flooding risk, where you could conceivably set the minimum floor level of new houses high enough so that if you get a major flood, whilst the land and the roads and so on around the house may be temporarily flooded, the valuable parts of the house itself are not. And then if you've identified that we can't accommodate for whatever risk it may be, then we can consider protection. So in reality for Busselton, the key risk is, the most significant risk is around erosion, and it is basically a choice between retreat or protect. That's essentially because the others are avoid, it's too late, and accommodate doesn't really work for erosion. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is just walk through what we are recommending for different sections of the coast. And we've got them grouped in 5 groups that represent essentially it's similar approaches being recommended for the different sections of the coast in those 5 groups. But the strategy, or the draft CHRMAP rather, actually divides the coast into 19 management units. So I'm just going to talk to Smith's Beach, Yelling Up and Bunker Bay first. So rather different issues there to what we have in most of Busselton and most of the Dunsborough urban area. It's not a low, flat, sandy coast. It tends to be rockier and a bit steeper. And it's not as exposed to erosion risk, but you still do get erosion over time. It just happens in a slightly different way. And some of you, I'm sure, may have some recollection of the awful Gracetown cliff collapse event of probably a few decades ago now. So you tend to get that pattern. Doesn't look like much is changing. And then if you're not careful, all of a sudden something can change very quickly. So our modelling suggests that all three of those areas are potentially vulnerable to erosion, but that given the assets at risk, that it would make sense to protect those sections of the coast from erosion. Inundation, flooding risk is not such an issue, particularly on the west coast. The flooding levels won't be quite as high, and also because the land sort of rises up from the coast fairly quickly, you can, we think, avoid flooding risk there by essentially not developing really close to the coast, and also making sure that the floor level of any buildings is above the projected flood level that we have to plan for. But just to give you a snapshot, I'm not going to run you through all of them, but this is Bunker Bay. You can see we've got these three erosion lines, a 2040 erosion line, a 2070 erosion line, and a 2120 erosion line. These are probably quite conservative. They assume that there's not a heck of a lot of rock that's really solid underneath those four dunes. There may well be some quite solid rock under there, but unless and until we have done the geological investigations, we probably need to be a little bit risk averse. And we're proposing that we would protect that section of the coast over time, which would most likely be through a combination of geotextile groins that help to break the wave action, reduce the wave energy, and reduce erosion, and probably in that location there through some strategic beach nourishment to offset losses from particular winter storms and so on. The next grouping is Eagle Bay and Old Dunsborough. Similar sort of issues. However, we tend to have a bit more development really close to the coast, and often, very narrow foreshore reserves. So again, proposing protection for the erosion hazard and accommodate for inundation hazard. In the main, we can avoid, but there are some private properties where the ground levels are sort of below about 3.5 metres above sea level. AHD means Australian Height Datum, which in plain English is above sea level. And so there are some private lots there where they would actually need to build above the ground level to achieve that. Only a very small number though. This is Old Dunsborough. Again, the same principle in terms of the erosion lines, the same limitation in terms of not having great geological information. And in particular here, the coast is probably quite a bit less vulnerable to erosion than what that indicates. But there still would be some properties, very close to the coast, which if the coast is not protected, could be undermined by coastal erosion. And of course, the roads along the coast and other infrastructure really close to the coast the same. Then just move into, just give you a flavour of what that looks like in the document itself. So if you go into the document and have a look at, the sections of the coast that you may be interested in, what you have is 3 time periods. So really short term, which is current day through to about 2040. Then a medium term, which is 2040 through to about 2070. And then a long term, which is 2070 through to 2120. And we've then setting out what is the fundamental strategy to deal with erosion hazard, which in this case is protect, or inundation hazard, which in this case is accommodate. And we then break down our response into a planning response, which is about how we're going to regulate development, an infrastructure coastal management response, which is really around what are we going to build or do to in this case, protect the coast, an emergency management response, recognising that we're not necessarily going to be able to use planning or infrastructure responses to deal with all of the hazards, and then a financial response, which is around how we intending to pay for this. So that's sort of how it's set out in the document, and then as you work your way through, you'll see that we then repeat the same approach for the other time periods, and then we have a very brief sort of key issues and key rationale approach. Then probably where most people live, whether it's where most people at the session this evening live or not, I don't know, but probably where most people live is, if they're living close to the coast anyway, is in that sort of relatively low, flat, sandy sections of the coast that really start more or less around sort of the Dunsborough town site, includes Quindalup, and then Abbey through to Wannerup in Busselton. In those areas, again, we're proposing protection against erosion risk. And these are the areas that more often than not have some sort of coastal protection from erosion in place already. And then in the shorter term, what we call an accommodate strategy for inundation or flooding hazard, and then a protect strategy long term. So just to talk to that a little bit, if we were not going to adopt a protect strategy long term for coastal flooding risk, we would potentially need to set the minimum floor level for new houses or similar as high as 3.8 metres above sea level. There are some existing lots where the current ground levels are 1.5 to 2 metres above sea level. And the feeling is that that would be certainly not ideal and probably an unreasonable response to require, essentially requiring people to have, an open space or garages or similar on ground floors, and any sort of bedrooms and living areas and so on would have to be on a first floor, which would also have impacts on people living next door whose houses would be lower, as well as substantial cost and other implications. So instead, what we're proposing is what we're referring to as an integrated flooding protection approach, whereby over time, we try and lift the whole of the foreshore to a height of around 3.5 to 4 metres above sea level, mostly through a buried seawall or groin. And we've got some images that sort of try and describe that a little bit later. But we can't do that immediately. It will take, at minimum, a number of decades to do that, possibly longer, and that we need to have an interim strategy. So what we're proposing as an interim strategy is that the minimum floor level for new development is set at 3 metres above sea level, which effectively means that progressively newer houses are at relatively low risk, protecting them from the worst impacts of coastal flooding, and progressively reducing the emergency management task that we may have if we have an event of that kind. And I'll talk in a little while just about what do we do with the gaps, the places like the entry to the Port Geographe Marina, where obviously you can't simply build a seawall across the whole front of the marina because you won't be able to get boats in and out, for instance. Just for information, there is a buried seawall at the Busselton foreshore near the jetty at the moment. Some of you may have seen that under construction. It's the second generation of buried seawalls in that location, and it gets to a level of a little bit over 3 metres above sea level already. So you can, if you get it right, do this in a way where it's not about sort of putting big walls in front of people's houses or along the coast that aren't particularly attractive. So this then is just Dunsborough town site, and you can see a slightly different sort of typology in terms of the way the plan's set out, but the same thing, sort of erosion lines for 3 different periods. The same approach in terms of how we set out recommendations. We then have the third sort of grouping of management units, which is Marybrook and Siesta Park, and then Forest Beach right at the eastern edge of the city. For those sections of the coast, again, we're proposing protect from erosion. And in fact, some of you may know there's quite a number of private coastal protection structures in that section of the coast currently. For flooding risk, though, we are recommending an accommodate approach, which would mean that the minimum floor level for new houses, etc., would be 3.8 metres above sea level, which is quite high. We won't have an opportunity to build an integrated flood protection structure through that area. There simply isn't the space to do so. Because development of private land is so close to the coast. Also, we, in the draft strategy, are leaving the option open for managed retreat in the longer term. One of the differences with this section of the coast is that it's a relatively discrete area with private land between the coast and Caves Road. And then you don't have a whole series of other residential areas that are further inland. That would essentially mean that rather than having a period where you retreated and then held the coast in a location, in those other areas, it would be an ongoing and incredibly disruptive process, most likely. Also, unlike most of the rest of the coast, there aren't significant public assets at risk, particularly in the next few decades. So there's very little public access to the coast in this section of the coast in this section of the city, and very little public infrastructure as well between Caves Road and the coast. So it's for that reason as well that a slightly different approach to funding is proposed in this area.
So sorry, Paul, my name's Dale Harris. Are you okay if I ask a question about that?
Dale, can I wait until I've finished the presentation and then take some questions, if that's okay?
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this again, within the strategy, you'll see that the erosion modelling, 2040, 2070, 2120. Again, it is quite conservative, but it does illustrate that even with that quite conservative modelling, it doesn't look as though Caves Road itself would be vulnerable in the next couple of decades. And then finally, just about on the home straight, folks, the last section of the coast, which is a bit unique, is the Lock Estate, or the area that many people refer to as the Holy Mile. Unlike most of the rest of the coast, there is actually no private land at risk, certainly for the next couple of decades. The land's in public ownership. The lessees there have maximum 21-year lease terms. So we can actually consider a slightly shorter planning timeframe there, aligned with the lease terms. What we're proposing here is a protection approach for erosion hazard and an accommodate approach for flooding hazard, but also through the lease arrangements, leaving the option open for managed retreat in the longer term. One of the interesting things about the Lock Estate, some of you may know, around 10 years ago now, there was a series of groins put in place to try and hold the coast. It's been quite effective, and the cost of those groins was actually met largely through the leases to the lease fees to the lessees, and has been a more cost-effective and efficient than them each doing their own work. It's also provided a better and more integrated coastal management outcome. So it's a similar sort of approach to some degree that we're proposing in the draft strategy for Siesta Park, etc. Okay, and then you can see the erosion modelling there. To inform the CHRMAP, one of the things that we put a lot of effort into was what we call a financial model. And there was a bunch of reasons for this, but one of the key reasons was that a lot of the received wisdom and much of the policy direction in Western Australia assumed that retreat would be a less expensive process than coastal protection. And we wanted to try and test that because certainly our sense was that large-scale retreat through much of Busselton's coast had a lot of problems with it, and that it may actually not be true that retreat, once you've made some reasonable assumptions about what processes might be involved in that, the retreat wouldn't actually be cheaper. So we developed a financial model. All of the scenarios that we modelled assume that we try and maintain for as much and as long as possible a continuous beach and foreshore reserve along the whole of our coast, rather than having some sections of the coast where you might have a beach and some sections of the coast where you might just have a seawall and no beach. And I'm sure you've seen places in the world where that's what you've ended up with. And then we modelled, assuming that outcome for each, we then modelled 3 scenarios. So one of those scenarios was to just simply try and hold the beach and hold the coast in place by what we call beach nourishment. So essentially putting more and more sand on the beach over time to try and hold the beach in place. And if you had enough sand, you could protect the coast from erosion hazard through that, but it wouldn't provide you with a protection against flooding. We then modelled a further scenario where we would protect the whole of the coast through a combination of structures, buried seawalls and groins, supplemented by beach nourishment to maintain the beach and the foreshore, but also to provide in the sections of the coast where we choose to do so, to provide an integrated flooding protection as well. And then the third scenario was what we call managed retreat. And what that costs is, what that estimates rather, is the costs of progressively buying up all of the affected private property, demolishing the houses, and I guess picking up and relocating the infrastructure, or at least demolishing the roads and the sewer pipes and so on. So it is not a perfect model, but we're pretty sure that it's the best model, the most complete model anyone's ever developed certainly in Western Australia, to try and work out which of these kinds of strategies might be most effective. This next slide then is just showing you a little bar chart, a line graph rather, of what that looks like. Now, on the left-hand side is the cumulative cost in billions of dollars. And the yellow line is what's estimated if we were to do retreat. And most of that cost is in land acquisition. And there are scenarios in which retreat could occur without unaffected value land acquisition. You can probably make your own judgments about how politically sustainable that sort of approach may be. But also it recognises that if you do lose those assets, it is a genuine financial loss to someone, and therefore it should be valued to some degree. What you can see there is that in our model, which again is not perfect, but it's about as good as an attempt as anyone has ever made, the total cost over the 100-year period is getting close to $9 billion. The red line is the beach nourishment scenario. So you can see that in the nearer term, it does look to be relatively inexpensive. But as time goes on and essentially as sea level goes up, the amount of sand that you have to put onto the beach every year goes up. And we're also expecting that the cost of sand would go up exponentially and significantly faster than general inflation. And it ends up very expensive. The blue line is then the protect strategy, which does start in the nearer term look more expensive, but over time looks to be the least expensive option. One of the things I will note here is that the vast majority of the costs in this model don't need to be met until post 2050. So I don't know if you can see my cursor there, folks, but you can see most of the costs are post 2050. So we do have a little bit of time to work this out, and including refining these models and so on, which I'm sure in future there'll be much better models than what we've managed to develop so far. As well as the City of Busselton dealing with these issues themselves, we also have quite a high focus on advocacy. The city's a member of an organisation called the Parent Naturalist Partnership, which is a partnership between the 9 local governments between Rockingham and Busselton. That is recognised Australia-wide as a leader in advocacy and work in this sort of space. So we work quite closely with them, and particularly the bigger local governments in that group, Bunbury, Mandurah, Rockingham and ourselves, have quite a proactive voice. We're also a member of the Australian Coastal Councils Association, so we share advocacy and information and so on with them. The city is also a member of Regional Cities Australia, and again, a lot of the major regional cities around the country are on the coast, as I'm sure you're aware. We are very proactive in seeking grant funding and have been reasonably successful in the past, although as more local governments around Western Australia are facing these kind of challenges, we're finding that we've got a lot more competition for a limited pool of state grant funding that's available. There is limited state support at present. There's really no support from the federal government in this space at all at present. But it's certainly not just an issue for Busselton. In order to have your voice heard, you can go to the Your Say Busselton part of the city's webpage. You can view the CHRMAP document. There's a frequently asked questions document that Louise has put together that you can have a look at there as well. There's contact details for city officers if you've got further questions. There's then a fairly simple portal to lodge a submission. You can write a certain amount of comments just straight into the also portal, and you can also upload a written submission if you find that you don't have enough space. We will also use that as a means of letting people know the further phases of the project. Submissions now close on the 27th of August. We do have another online information session next Thursday. We have written to a number of community organisations and offered to meet with them separately, and we've had some take up those offers. And particularly because we're proposing some different approaches in the Siesta Park Marybrook area, landowners in that area were sent correspondence directly, and over coming weeks we may well look to have a meeting with landowners in that area, in addition to the other engagement that we're doing. I'll just quickly show you what the document looks like. With me, folks, while I remember how to use the IT. Can't work out how to use the IT. Oh no, here we go. I have now. So yeah, on the screen in front of you now is what the document looks like. It is a fairly lengthy document. It is tried as hard as we can to make it readable. If you do want to look at the actual recommendations and so on, they are in the back part of the main part of the document, and then there's a lot of other background and context in there. So look, that's the end of my presentation.